The morning light in Dry Creek had a way of sifting through the dust like gold through a prospector's pan. But for Clara May Hollister, it was just another day of braving the stairs. She walked the length of Main Street with her 3 girls in tow, Anna with her chin stubbornly high at 9 years old, Ruthie half hidden behind her sister's skirt, and little Pearl gripping her mother's hand so tight her knuckles blanched. The store bell jangled as they stepped inside the general store. Clara felt it then, the shift in the air, the silence folding on itself. Mrs. Liddy Pruitt's voice carried in a whisper not meant to be private. "That's her, the one who only makes girls." It was said with that peculiar cruelty of small towns, the kind that wears the mask of pity. Clara's spine stayed straight. She gathered her flour and salt, laid her coins on the counter without fumbling, and left before her daughters could hear more than they already had. Outside, the wind tugged at her skirt, lifting the hem to show the fraying she had no means to mend. Her mind, unwilling but restless, drifted to years before all this. She had once been a mail-order bride, answering letters from a man named Bartholomew Griggs, Bart, as he signed them, whose script promised warmth, a home, and a man's strong arm to lean on. She arrived from Kansas in a borrowed dress, stepping down from the stagecoach to meet a man thicker in the belly than his photograph suggested, his eyes scanning her like a horse at auction. At first, things were tolerable. But the day she handed him their 3rd daughter, his mouth tightened into something she had not seen before, a cold, hard line that no smile could break. 3 girls, he muttered, as if tallying a loss. The weeks after were slow unspooling. Meals eaten in silence, nights spent alone, kindness drying up like a creek in August. One morning, without warning, she found her belongings on the porch and the door barred behind her. The town, siding with a man who owned the most cattle in 2 counties, called a shame. Clara knew better. It was exile. From his own stretch of land miles away, Elias Crowther had watched her pass now and again, a slim figure against the horizon, leading her girls as though she had a place to go that wasn't just the next day's survival. Elias was a man shaped by absence. His wife and infant son had been buried on the same autumn morning years ago, and since then, words seemed to him like stones. Best used sparingly, else they weigh a man down. Still, when he saw her in town, something in the slope of her shoulders, the stubborn way she met the ground with each step, stirred a flicker of familiarity in him, like hearing an old tune you once knew by heart. The week Martha Hollister arrived, the air in town seemed to change. She was Clara's younger sister, prettier in that untouched way that comes from never having been left out in a storm too long. Her hair caught the light, and her laugh rang freely. By her 2nd afternoon in Dry Creek, Bart Griggs had tipped his hat to her in the street. Clara had seen that tilt of his head before. It meant a man had decided what he wanted and believed it already his. Later that night, over a supper of beans and cornbread, Clara warned her sister, "That man will promise you a home, but you'll starve for kindness inside it." Martha only smiled faintly, as though Clara's words were another story of bitterness spun from too many disappointments. One rain-heavy afternoon, Clara was hanging wash linens when she realized Pearl was no longer in the yard. The fence gate stood ajar, swinging on its hinges. Panic sliced through her as she scanned the road. Out of the curtain of rain came the sound of hooves. Elias Crowther appeared, his dark coat slick with water, Pearl perched on a saddle like a bundle of cotton. He dismounted without hurry, setting the child down gently. "Found her wandering near the main road," he said, voice quiet as gravel underfoot. Clara felt a rush of relief, so strong it left her unsteady. She knelt, pulling Pearl close, then looked up at Elias. There was no judgment in his eyes, only the steady regard of someone who knew what it was to nearly lose what you could not replace. "Keep a better hold of what matters," he murmured, tipping his hat before leading his horse back into the rain. That night, when the girls were asleep and the wind hummed low through the eaves, Clara sat at the small kitchen table and stared at the flickering lamplight. The memory of Elias's voice lingered. It wasn't the words. It was the way they seemed to settle into the room, quiet but unshakable. She thought of Bart's visits to town, his glances at Martha, the murmurs she'd overheard of him boasting in the saloon. There was a storm building, and not just in the weather. She could feel it in her bones, the same way a farmer feels the air thicken before rain. She had lived through enough to know that storms didn't always pass harmlessly by. They sometimes came straight for your door. When she finally blew out the lamp, the room sank into darkness. Outside, rain drummed a steady rhythm on the roof, a reminder that the world kept moving, no matter how still you tried to stand. Somewhere in that dark, a man named Elias Crowder was riding home alone, and though Clara didn't know it yet, the next time he stopped at her gate, he wouldn't be bringing back a lost child. He'd be offering her and her girls something far rarer than pity. He'd be offering a way out. The wind had shifted by the next week, carrying with it the smell of rain and something heavier, like the metallic taste before lightning strikes. Clara noticed Bart Griggs in town more often now, his gaze drifting past her to where Martha stood, leaning on a hitching post and laughing at some small-town joke. There was a hunger in his look that made Clara's stomach knot. She had seen that same glint in his eyes before, just before the cruelty began. Rumors slid through the town like oil on water. Mrs. Liddy Pruitt, never one to leave a story unembroidered, spoke of Bart's intentions toward Martha, shaking her head, as if he were doing the Hollisters a charitable turn. Clara understood the truth. Men like Bart did nothing from kindness. That evening, while the girls played jacks on the floor, Clara sat across from Martha at the table. The lamplight softened her sister's face, but there was a restlessness there, a flicker of something not unlike temptation. "You think he means to marry me?" Martha said, not quite a question. Clara set down her sewing and looked her square in the eye. "I think he means to own you. There's a difference, and it's one you won't see until it's too late." Martha's smile was faint, and her eyes slid away. She had not lived long enough in the shadow of a man's disappointment to understand the cost. Elias Crowder heard the talk, too. He was in the saloon late one afternoon, nursing a coffee more for the warmth and the taste, when Bart came in, boasting to a pair of ranch hands. "She'll come around," Bart said, with the certainty of a man used to bending the world his way. "And if not, well, I've a mind to take what's owed." There was laughter, but it faltered when Elias set down his cup and spoke. His voice was low, but carried through the room. "Careful," he said, as if weighing each word. "The dust you kick up might choke you." The silence that followed was thick enough to drink. Bart's smile tightened, but he turned back to his men. Elias rose, paid for his coffee, and left without another word. The night the storm rolled in, Clara sensed it before the first raindrop fell. The clouds gathered fast, a black wall sweeping in from the west. The girls were asleep early, lulled by the patter on the roof. Clara sat at the window, watching the fence posts vanish into the curtain of rain. She thought of Elias's steady gaze, the quiet way he returned Pearl to her arms. Something in her wanted to believe that if trouble came, he might stand between it and her door. She had no more than formed the thought when the pounding came. Bart stood on the porch, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. His voice was loud enough to wake the girls. "You think you can keep her from me?" he barked, eyes flicking toward where Martha had appeared in the doorway, pale and wide-eyed. Clara stepped between them, her body a barrier as sure as any wall. "Get off my land," she said, her voice low but unshaking. Bart took a step forward, the boards groaning under his weight. That was when she heard the sound, hoofbeats in the rain. Elias rode in like the storm had brought him. He dismounted in one motion, the rain streaming off his coat. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You're coming with me," he said to Clara, as if it were the only thing that made sense. She didn't ask where, didn't question. She turned, gathered the girls from their beds, and within minutes they were wrapped in blankets, lifted into Elias's wagon. Martha stood in the doorway, trembling, but Clara didn't look back. Some roads had to be left behind without farewell. They took the back trails, the ones that wound between low hills and kept the cover of cottonwoods. The rain came in sheets, the lantern swinging from the wagon side, casting fleeting glimpses of Elias's profile. Set determined but calm. He said little, but each glance he gave her told her she and the girls were under his keeping now. The steady creak of the wagon wheels became a kind of heartbeat in the dark. By first light, they were near the river crossing. The storm had swelled the water, turning it into a boiling, mud-brown surge. Clara's breath caught when she saw Bart's shape ahead, blocking the way. His horse stamped at the muddy bank, nostrils flaring. "You think you can steal from me, Crowther?" Bart's voice was raw with drink and rage. Elias stepped down from the wagon, the mud sucking at his boots. "A man can't steal what was never yours," he said evenly. Bart's hand twitched toward his coat pocket, but he never drew anything. In the charged stillness, the river roared like a living thing. Bart dismounted, his boots slipping in the muck as he lunged toward Clara. She saw it all in fragments. The flare at his eyes, the smell of whiskey, the sudden grip of fear on her chest. Then Elias was there, catching Bart's shoulder and shoving him hard into the mud. Bart went down with a grunt, scrambling up only to meet Elias's stare, cold and unyielding. "You won't come near them again," Elias said. There was no threat in it, just certainty. Bart spat into the mud, the fight gone out of him, and turned his horse toward the opposite bank. Clara watched him disappear into the trees, the tension in her shoulders loosening for the first time in years. Elias helped her back into the wagon without a word, guiding the horses into the churning water. The wheels groaned, the current tugging, but they made the far bank. The air felt different there, lighter, as though the river had carried some of the past away with it. Clara stepped down, her boots sinking into the soft earth. She turned to Elias, meeting his eyes. There was no grand speech, no declaration, just the quiet truth of what had happened. He had chosen to stand with her, and that choice had changed everything. The girls were already running ahead toward the open prairie, their laughter thin but bright in the morning air. Clara lingered, her hand in Elias's a moment longer than necessary, as if testing the weight of trust before she let go. The sun broke through the thinning clouds, scattering gold across the wet grass. Somewhere behind them lay the life she'd been told to endure. Ahead was something undefined but unbroken. The old voice of the narrator would later recall, "Some roads take you away from what you thought was home. Others carry you where your soul has been heading all along." Clara looked once more at Elias, then followed her girls into the new day, the wind clean and full in her lungs.